the abolition of surrogate motherhood. My name is Clara Berglund, and I am the Secretary General of the Swedish Women's Lobby, which is an independent umbrella organization for the women's movement in Sweden, and we are also a proud member of the coalition. Surrogate motherhood is incompatible with women's full human rights. My name is Clara. So I think, can everyone hear me all right? Because there was an echo. Yes, all right. So I'll go on. Surrogate motherhood is incompatible with women's full human rights and gender equality. During last year, the closed borders and restrictions due to COVID-19 has further revealed the exploitative nature of this global industry that profits on vulnerable women. Tonight, we will listen to interventions from 3 experts that will discuss the medical, psychological, and legal consequences of surrogacy, as well as what can be done to stop this growing trade in women and children. First, we will get to listen to Anna Loana Stuis-Deram, who is the co-chair of the International Coalition for the Abolition of Surrogate Motherhood. After that, we will listen to Yagmur Yurakisi, who is a feminist activist from the Radical Girls Network. And lastly, we will hear from Anna Subina, who is the policy coordinator of the European Network of Migrant Women. Hopefully, we will then have time for some questions for the panelists. So you can please use the chat function here in Zoom to type in your questions, and we will pick out some questions for the last part of the session. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker. I already mentioned that Anna Loana Stuis-Deram is the co-chair of the coalition, but she's also a sociologist. And she will talk about how the invisible violence of surrogacy undermines women's rights. So the floor is yours, Anna Loana.
Thank you. Thank you, Clara. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for being here for this discussion about surrogacy. I would like to share with you an idea, which is that the invisibilization of the violence contained in the surrogacy is weakening the women's human rights. And here is my point. Most of the time, surrogacy, motherhood, is presented as a means through which people can become parents and be happy about. The images and the statements of this happiness was justify considering surrogacy. I'm sorry, I just read with this screen. Considering surrogacy as a means whose only reason for being is the satisfaction of those who want to use it. The feminist analysis of surrogacy proposes to a complementary approach, which is centered on the experience of the surrogate mother. This approach considers surrogacy not as a means, but as a global experience of life, specifically female experience. Consider it in its globality, which includes all the relationship of the surrogate mother and her experience of all the stages of this practice. Surrogacy reveals itself as an accumulation of violence against women, an invisibilized and a normalized violence. The violent dimension of surrogacy is structurally invisibilized because it is a violence made specifically to women. Not naming it weakens the women's human rights. What is violence against women? Violence is considered a violence of human rights, as well as a detriment to health and sustainable economic development. Ending or simply reducing violence would contribute to human well-being. Violence against women is a specific form of violence and must be understood and addressed with this specificity in mind. The UN General Assembly adopted a definition of violence against women in 1993 in its declaration of of the elimination of all forms of violence against women, which is the first international instrument to deal with this phenomenon. And the first article of this declaration states that the term of violence against women means any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women. The experts show that it is important to introduce the comparative variable of gender to better understand specificities of violence against women. The analysis of the gender nature of violence requires comparisons between women and men. Surrogacy includes violence exclusively against women, since only the surrogate mothers suffer harm, damage, and pain as a result of their surrogacy. For this reason, it is necessary to use international definitions in the description of the practice in order to highlight its violent dimension, which is invisible in the discourses that consider it only as a means. The practice of surrogacy is not part of the violence against women concerned by the international texts. However, given the harm it causes to surrogate mothers in particular and to women in general, to women's rights in general, it is necessary to fill this gap. What is surrogacy? Surrogacy is the practice of recruiting a woman who has no desire for a child, whether for remuneration or not, to bear one or more children, whether or not conceived with her own auspices, for the purpose of handing them over to a person or persons who wish to be assigned as parents of those children. The child may or may not be genetically related to the persons who request the delivery. And depending on the country, the practice is legal, tolerated, or prohibited. To observe and analyze surrogacy is to put the woman mother at the center of the practice. That is to recognize her unique and indispensable place. In order to follow experts' recommendations, it is essential to take into consideration all the people involved in this practice and to show, according to gender, sex, who are de facto victims of violence, taking into account the intentions, the actions, and the consent when it comes to identified damages. The ecological framework theorized by Laurie Heiser to analyze violence against women is also operational to examine surrogacy. This framework addresses gender-based violence as a multifaceted phenomenon grounded in an interplay among personal, situational, and socio-cultural factors. And its application highlights the embedded levels of causality. As a global experience of life, surrogacy includes procedures performed exclusively on women, which cause or may cause them damage, harm, and suffering of various kinds: physical, sexual, psychological, or economic. First of all, it is a medical violence. The fact that a woman in good health and without any desire for a child receives a powerful hormonal treatment in order to become pregnant is in itself a medical violence, insofar as these treatments can have or often do have harmful consequences in the short, medium term on the health of the women who receive them. The long-term consequences are rarely researched and known. Doctors are well aware of the consequences, and they know that the woman has no desire for a child. Nevertheless, they do not hesitate to administer medication without medical justification. Before and during pregnancy, the woman also undergoes intrusive obstetric procedures, some of which may not be medically justified. The number of embryos inseminated is most often decided by the client, as well as the number of fetuses to be kept in case of multiple pregnancies. I just have two examples. One, it's a study of 10 years of surrogacy data in Netherlands, which shows that the health risks of surrogate mothers are much higher than those of ordinary pregnancies. And the other one is an American study that analyzed data on the pregnancies and deliveries of 124 American women, comparing their ordinary pregnancies with those that they carried as surrogates. And the study shows that surrogacy deliveries record more obstetric complications, such as gestational diabetes, hypertension, amniocentesis, placenta previa, administration of antibiotics, and cesarean section. We can also identify psychological violence, which is generated by anxiety and depression. The psychological suffering appears as well in personal testimonies of mothers as in studies like the one realized by Susan Golombok, who shows that surrogates had higher levels of depression during pregnancy and post-birth. The risks generated by dissociation are not measured. Also, many testimonies of surrogate mention this injunction, which is addressed to them and which can also be stipulated in the contracts, which ask the mother to guarantee that she will not become attached to the child she will give birth to. Psychiatrist Ekman has studied this aspect and shows how dissociation takes place through the repetition of mental distancing and bodily separation. A legal dimension to the abuse may also be identified. The law or contract provides for actions that may be harmful to the mother. The contract may make illegal demands without the mother's knowledge, and the law can ensure that the contract is honored, regardless of the suffering and damage inflicted on the mother. It can also ensure that the child is taken from the mother despite her opposition. And situations of this type have occurred even in the United States, where mothers have been prevented from seeing or even touching the child they have given birth to. Surrogacy also contains a dimension of economic violence. First of all, the vast majority of women who became surrogate mothers do so in a family and in a social professional context, where the money can bring in is very important. This is notably the case for the Indian, Ukrainian, Russian, Mexican, Georgian, Thai, Cambodian, Bulgarian, Romanian, Lithuanian women. For instance, an Indian woman was telling to the researchers who came to interview her that they give us the money and we give them the baby. Like how you take a house for rent, similarly, our womb was taken for rent. As for the American mothers, also many of them, when asked, said that money are not the main motivation. They also acknowledge that it is very useful to the family. In this context, the clients find ways to negotiate the mother's remuneration, seeking to reduce it with the help of agencies, which can go so far as to put the women in competition with each other in order to persuade them to lower their financial claims. When the clients live in a country other than the mother's, non-payment of the full sum initially announced can frequently occur, especially since the women have neither the money, nor the knowledge, nor the connections necessary to assert their rights, if the law protects them. Sheila Saravana, Pinky Dirani, Rita Banerjee have exposed this situation for several years concerning the Indian surrogate mothers. By applying the ecological framework of analysis of violence to surrogacy, we observe that the only people who are harmed are the surrogate mothers. They are the only who suffer harmful consequences for their health in the form or more or less long-lasting affections, the only one who suffer psychological and emotional violence, the only ones to be denied their rights, the only ones to experience economic violence, the only ones who can die. no man suffers any of these damages. The attempts of some mothers to keep the child on surrogacy have all ended in failure, both in Great Britain and the United States. In surrogacy is a form of sex-based violence exercised exclusively against women. Invisibilizing sex-based violence is a structural phenomenon. The violence of surrogacy is invisibilized in several ways, both in individual and collective behaviors, and in the structural organization of gender relations. First, the violence is invisibilized by the massive use of gender stereotypes in promotional narratives, which focus solely on surrogacy as a means, not as a woman's overall life experience. Secondly, by internalization and sacrificial transfiguration in the autobiographical stories of women who tell of their successive surrogate pregnancies, which led to postpartum hemorrhage or even to hysterectomy, while emphasizing their happiness at having carried these pregnancies at the cost of their sacrifice. Thirdly, the invisibilization of violence is ensured by simultaneously ignoring the sex-based character of the practice and its impact on the collective situation of all women by showing exclusively individual situations apprehended through the prism of women's consent. Fourth, the surrogacy violence is invisibilized by an institutional organization of the denial of violence through the contractualization of the interpersonal agreement that lies at the root of a surropregnancy. It is a structural violence, nourished and justified by the general acceptance of a system of gender-based norms that saturate the relationships between the people involved in the practice. Structural violence is often invisible because of its manifestation in everyday acts, and they are linked to legitimate moral values in society. Most violence is not deviant behavior, not disapproved of, but to the contrary, is defined as virtuous action in the service of generally applauded conventional social, economic, and political norms, experts show. In surrogacy, we find the three modalities according to which the invisibilization of violence can be recognized, namely structural violence, symbolic violence, and normalized violence. The normalization of the surrogacy violence is based on its structural and symbolic dimension. The normalization can be seen in institutional practices, in discourses, in the values conveyed by the media, in daily interactions, in bureaucratic routine. I don't think I have the time, so I will not present this example. It's too pity. When international bodies that are supposed to consider the respect of human rights as an unbreakable limit of the acts that they rule on, ignore the violence inherent to surrogacy, they contribute to the normalization of violence against women. This is all the more true when it comes to bodies that produce legal norms. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. The accumulation of violence generated by this practice is part of the continuum of violence against women, maintained as a necessary basis of a social system in which social and power relations are necessarily also sex-based relations. Maintaining the inequalities between women and men, normalizing violence against women, ensures the flourishing market of reproduction, the indispensable female bodies consenting to their exploitation. For decades, feminists have warned that activities that were once considered archetypal of women's subordinate status are now considered liberating personal choices, as Audre Lorde said some 40 years ago, only within a patriarchal structure is maternity the only social power open to women. Accepting for the happiness of others to experience violence that puts one's health and life at risk is not a sign of liberation, but a neoliberal trap, making consent the source of profit. Identifying and naming violence against women is the first step to stop this predation and to make women's rights respected. To stop this violence, we promote an international convention for the abolition of surrogacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna Luana. There's so much to say about this topic, and I think that some of the information that you have been giving and ideas about the Convention for the Abolition of Surrogacy Motherhood has also been uploaded to the NGO CSW platform for those that are interested. And we will now turn to our next speaker, Yagbur Yurakisi. And Yagbur is a member of the Radical Girls Network for girls and young women with a migrant background in Europe that have come together to fight for the liberation of women and girls from patriarchal structures and mentalities. And tonight, Yagbur will talk about the dissociation and coping mechanisms for women and for surrogate mothers. Please go ahead, Yagbur.
Thank you very much. So good evening. I will build on a lot of what Anna Luana has been speaking about, and I will try to zoom out a bit to include other issues of male violence and to understand surrogacy's place within that. I'm bearing in mind Kathleen Berry's warning against single issue feminism. All the pieces matter and they are all linked to each other. And it's only when we look at those different links that we can understand surrogacy's role under patriarchy. And actually this parcelization of issues within feminism itself is a mirror of what I would like to talk about today, this phenomenon that Anna Luana, you have also mentioned, which is dissociation. So dissociation is a psychological phenomenon that occurs when a person is in a situation of extreme danger with no escape. So say a man is beating you up, he is raping you, he is torturing you. What do you try to do? You try to evade with your mind. You try to pretend you are not there and it is not happening to you. And it is widely observed for women in prostitution, and I think it's the most clear example of it. So you have, Kajsa Ekis-Ekman as well, she's worked a lot on it. And she, for example, identifies the fact that women in prostitution give a different name from their own as a way to dissociate themselves from the act. So to pretend it is not happening to themselves, to try to preserve their true self. So it's not so much about protecting your anonymity, but really protecting yourself. And Kajsa Ekis-Ekman talks about the split self, because dissociation tries to achieve the impossible. It tries to split the body from the mind. So obviously, when you try a process like this, there are consequences, and you lose a part of yourself in that. I'm thinking about the Irish activist Rachel Moran. In her book Paid For: My Journey Through Prostitution, she explains that she's lost, because of the male violence that she has to suffer, she has lost the ability to dance. A part of you is gone when you have to split from yourself. And we see that a lot as well in surrogacy. So we hear that from women who have to give up their child. One of them says, I am an incubator. And those words should horrify us, because she's not saying I'm a woman, I'm a mother. She says, I'm a thing, I'm an incubator. And the whole discourse surrounding surrogacy assumes and implies and is based on this idea of dissociation. So we have women as ovens, and even in English, labor, you labor the land. So we have this idea of pregnancy as something completely passive. You just wait there, you're the land, and the man inseminates and nothing happens for 9 months, but we know in reality which of the two sexes is much more passive in pregnancy. We also have expressions like third-party reproduction. What does that even mean? I mean, for all I know, it could be somebody doing a painting, a reproduction of a famous painting. Third-party reproduction. We have womb rental, and I will come back on that one. And we have my favorite of all, outsourcing pregnancy. So it's as if you could take parts of a woman and outsource pregnancy. And again, here it's also a reference to labor, both manual work and labor as pregnancy. So this reminds me, this idea that the parts are split from the whole, it makes me think about German Greer's saying that girls are born whole. But we are progressively dissociated, split from ourselves and from other women. We are fragmented. This is what Janice Raymond would talk about. So we have first, obviously, this mind-body dissociation. And we all know women are bodies without mind. And we've had tons of male intellectuals who've repeated that for years and years. And within this first distinction, mind-body, we then have further fragmentation within the body itself. And each part, here it's a tentative, it's a non-exhaustive list as well, unfortunately, of various industries and practices that have taken fragments away from women. And what happens of this mindless body, it's there to fulfill a function. Each part of this body is there to fulfill a function. This is what objects do. So from fragmentation, we arrive to objectification. So now there is something, so I have obviously made Janice Raymond's thought much more simpler here to not go into details, but there is something that she talks about, but she doesn't actually name, which I think is very relevant here. And it's actually two figures of speech. So one of them is called the synecdoche and the other a metonymy. And you could say they're closely related to each other. You could even say the one is part of the other, but it's just a general view of these figures of speeches. And what they do, we use them all the time without realizing. So synecdoche is part for the whole. So when we say number 10, we're using the street number to designate the cabinet of the prime minister. When we use a metonymy, it goes through association. So if I'm saying, for example, I'm reading a Renate Klein, everybody knows I'm not actually reading Renate Klein. I'm reading a book by Renate Klein. And this is what happens in the language of surrogacy, exactly. So I've talked about womb rental before. Womb rental is a form of synecdoche. You have the part for the whole. You have part of the womb that is used to designate the mother and the woman. And then we have the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, who is talking about mothers as gestational carriers. And then it becomes carrier. We don't know what these women are carrying. We have no idea. For all we know, we could be talking about delivery boys, And then there is a further step in that it becomes GC. Part for the whole, association rather. Actually, this is more of a metonymy because it's function for the whole. GC. Where is the mother? Where is the woman? And because those parts have been so split from the whole that we have lost woman. Now let's take a further step back and discuss about procreation more generally, because this sort of practice, the synecdoche, we see it a lot when we talk about procreation. So we have those expressions like uterus havers, cervix havers, vagina holders. All of those are synecdoches. And we have those people who menstruate, menstruators, more of a metonymy. And we have lost the woman. So it's as if those experiences, those unique experiences to women are happening independently of us. So Clued In Clue is this sort of app website that helps you regulate your cycle. And I wouldn't trust them the same way that I wouldn't trust this American Society for Reproductive Medicine. And there is something very telling here, in that they say that female is dehumanizing. Now, what can a woman understand when she hears that the word female is dehumanizing? Well, I assume that it takes the humanity away. So I assume that perhaps female humans don't exist. Perhaps women don't exist. Perhaps women are not human. Is that, this is the logic that I would go through with my mindless body. And it goes, this expression here, this is very telling, female is dehumanizing. It goes at the crux of the matter, because I myself have erred for a long time on this issue of dehumanization. But what is really happening here is dewomanization. So I'm trying something here. Okay, I'm trying to stop the share. This is a nightmare, apologies. Okay, thank you. So dewomanizing. So what do I mean by this? When I hear things like surrogacy is a human rights violation, yes, of course, because women are human. But it's not accurate, because as what you were saying, Ana Luana, it can only, it's a violence that can be exclusively done to women, because only women can become pregnant. Mankind is an incorporation, humankind, and assimilation. So we understand the problem of talking about mankind for both women and men, because it's this idea, Adam's rib, women are part of men. So if you talk about men, you're talking about women as well. But humanity as well is an assimilation in the sense that it erases the differences between the two sexes, and it comes back to this oneness, as if there was one sex. And when I always, so let me make sense of this. So I always hear people saying, oh, but why should sex be such an important variable? I mean, why are we not as obsessed with people's eye colors? Well, because you can't make babies with your eyes. The sexual differences are at the heart of the perpetuation of the species. They are relevant differences, and they remind us that the two sexes are asymmetric. Now, this dewomanization, to relate back to dissociation. So when we were talking about dissociation, I said that the woman, the individual woman who has to endure this process of splitting herself from herself, loses a part of herself. So when we translate dissociation at the global level for all women, the conclusion of your talk, Ana Luana, thank you, it follows perfectly. Dissociation is the process whereby we lose our womanity. This is what we're talking about. And it took me, this is a concept that a friend of mine, Liliana Ricci, told me years ago. And I hadn't understood until I heard Céline Picq, a French feminist, say that pornography is the systematic destruction of women. And words like, and it's the same with surrogacy. It can only happen to women because only women can be pregnant. Breast ironing can only happen to women. Female sexual and genital mutilation can only happen to women. In fact, what is the difference between circumcision and mutilation? It's the sex. And here again, with surrogacy, we have a systematic destruction of women. Exploitation is not enough as a concept, because it's not, the problem is not that we're extracting more than we should. The problem is that this is butchery. This is splitting parts of women and splitting women across among each of us. So this is, when we have those expressions, when we have this process of the part for the whole, the synecdoche, this metonymy, our womanity is at stake. And we need to invent our own words, because language is also ours. And if we're not bold in our speech, we won't be bold anywhere else. We're losing our womanity with all those attacks that are ongoing against us, but we will push back. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jagmur. So we should do exactly what the surrogacy industry has been doing all along. It's inventing new words like womb rental. So now it's our turn to do the same, to define that this is in fact sex-based violence. I noticed in the chat that there was a question about if this event should be more like objective and neutral to surrogacy. And I just want to underline that if you are looking for an event about the pros and cons with surrogacy, then you've come to the wrong place, because this event, as it says in the title, is about surrogacy motherhood as a form of violence against women, and it's organized by an organization that's called the Coalition for the Abolition of Surrogacy Motherhood. So that's our starting point today. I can also remind you to use the chat to put in questions that we can ask the speakers later on. And now the time has come for me to introduce our final expert, Anna Sobina. And Anna is the policy coordinator of the European Network of Migrant Women. And she will talk about the links between migration and trafficking and surrogacy. Welcome, Anna. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara. And thank you, the two speakers before me. And it is, of course, always extremely difficult to speak about such an intellectual giant as Jagmor. So I will try to do my best. And I will try to build on something that Jagmor was presenting. In particular, I think in her opening, she said that there is no such thing as a single issue feminism. There is no such thing as a single issue oppression. We work as an intersectional organization. And this is my approach in this presentation to the issue of surrogacy. So first of all, let me introduce the organization that I represent. We are a migrant women-led platform based in Europe. Our members are grassroots organizations, mostly service providers. And we are an organization and a platform that recognizes prostitution, pornography, trafficking, as well as surrogacy as forms of violence against women and sexual and reproductive exploitation of women. We are a member in the Coalition for the Abolition of Surrogacy, and we joined relatively recently, and we're very proud and eager to be the members because we are a proactive organization. And what I mean by this is that we work on the issues that are known and widely recognized, such as, for example, the issue of forced marriage or female genital mutilation, that of course a while ago was not recognized as form of violence against women, but thankfully now it is. But we also work on the emerging issues, those issues that we identify that present a serious threat in the near future for our target group, who are the migrant and refugee women. And surrogacy is one of such issues. We also, by being proactive, that means that we do not wait until women become harmed in such quantities that would entitle us to present our cases before the court, but we rather use our experiential knowledge in our feminist analysis to forecast certain scenarios that can be favorable or unfavorable or harmful to migrant women. And for this reason, we have launched a joint research with CIAMS, with the Coalition for Abolition of Prostitution, and we will be presenting the results hopefully in the near future on this subject. So what surrogacy has to do with migration? First of all, let me tell you how we view migration. Migration for us is a broad term. It's a broad definition that encompasses economic migrants, women who migrate for family reunification or education, those who are forcefully displaced, including internally displaced persons, refugees, undocumented women who lost or maybe never had their status, legal status, and as well as women of second generation born in Europe. So it is in this understanding of the complexity of migration experience and the abuses of human rights that proliferate around the area of our work, which is migration and women, And indeed, in conjunction with our values and positions, which are feminist values and positions, that we are looking at the issue of surrogacy. Our positions, I already mentioned earlier that we view prostitution, obviously trafficking for all purposes, all exploitation as a form of violence against women, but we pay specific attention to sexual and reproductive exploitation. That, of course, we view as a root of patriarchal oppression and control over women, but also what we know, statistically speaking, in the European Union, sexual exploitation, and sexual exploitation is always at the intersection with reproductive exploitation, is the most widespread form of exploitation and violence against migrant women. Now, we know that there is a certain invitation from certain organizations like the International Labour Organization, who would like to count exploitation and prostitution as a form of labor exploitation. We disagree with this, and we think that sexual exploitation as well as reproductive exploitation should be statistically disaggregated in a different category. So this is our approach. Additionally, we view sexual and reproductive exploitation as well as trafficking as a demand-driven market, right? Demand and supply, of course. So where there is a demand, there will be generated a supply. And we know from, for example, the situation in the institution of prostitution, that who is mostly exploited in Europe, it is the migrant women. Now, with regards to surrogacy, concretely and its links with trafficking and the situation of migrant and refugee women. First of all, let's be reminded that surrogacy is not a new phenomenon. It is not a new form of violence against women. In fact, it is one of the oldest forms of exploitation of women. So listen to this. Sarah and Abraham were married, but couldn't conceive a child on their own. So Sarah turned to her slave, Hagar, to be a mother of Abraham's child. Well, we all know, or maybe most of us know, where this comes from. It is not something new. It's actually the book of Genesis. And what is more interesting, that this is a quote from actually the website called surrogate.com. So what changed now, of course, is not the fact that some other woman would carry a child for a woman who is either unable or not willing to carry a child, but rather the method of making this woman pregnant. And so now we have the reproductive technologies and companies and big clinics coming into this business of surrogacy. But let's be reminded that this is not the case everywhere. In some countries in the world, and there are a lot of them, there's still what the surrogate.com describes as traditional surrogacy, which means raping a woman, is still prevalent. For example, in Libya, where there are women who are trying to reach Europe from sub-Saharan Africa, and we know that overwhelming majority of them are already victims of sexual violence and rape and various forms of other violence. They become trapped in these so-called baby factories before they reach Europe. What happens with these women? They're being kept there, they're being systematically raped, they're being prostituted, but they're also being raped with the purpose of impregnating them in order then to take their children and sell them on the actual slave market. This is what's happening in Libya, and we know this is documented. Similar cases there are in Nigeria, where there are, again, they call it the, the clinics, the maternity clinics, effectively, they function as a baby factories, and sometimes women are delivered there and they're repeatedly raped. Sometimes they are delivered there when they're already pregnant and they were raped previously. But the point is that they're kept in those clinics in order to extract their babies and put them on sale. What also we need to consider when we speak about surrogacy and migration, of course, a woman doesn't need to be a migrant to be a victim of exploitation through surrogacy. Just like a woman does not to be a migrant to be a victim of exploitation in the system of prostitution. However, and I already mentioned it before, in Europe, and this is a statistically provable fact, the overwhelming majority of those persons who are found in the system of prostitution, particularly in the countries where it has been legalized, but also in those where it is semi-regulated, or even in the countries that installed the Nordic model that punishes the sex buyers, the overwhelming majority of women in prostitution, they're migrant women. They can be women from Eastern Europe, from within Europe. So legally speaking, they're not migrants. They would be described as third country, as European mobile citizens. But very often they also come from outside of European Union. And what are the categories of women who are most at risk of these forms of exploitation? We have internally displaced women. So, for example, there are cases of, this is outside of Europe, but we have documented cases of Myanmar where women are trafficked to China, and we know that there is demand, there is a bride trade going on, and in parallel with being sold into, being a wife, women are also exploited in surrogacy. We know that there are, according to some local organization in Myanmar, there are in some provinces of China between 15 to 20,000 women who are currently kept in captivity as brides. What we do not know is how many of them are exploited through surrogacy as well, but we know that the possibility of this is very real. Women who are seeking asylum, another category of women who may be in the refugee camp, who are in desperate economic and legal circumstances, who would be targeted by those traffickers who recruit women in order to exploit them through surrogacy. The ordinary migrant women who arrive, and they of course struggle to find employment in Europe, and they are being pushed into poverty. Undocumented women and women without citizenship. Now, think about this category. In Lebanon, you have in the refugee camps the whole generation of young girls who are born in the camps who have no citizenship whatsoever. Those girls do not exist on paper. How easy it is to target those girls in order to recruit them for what is growing demand globally for the market of surrogacy. Then we have women who are victims of forced marriage. The overlap, the intersection between forced marriage and the bride trade is absolutely clear, as is verifiable already through the cases that we have both in Europe and outside of Europe. And of course, the women exploited in prostitution and the trafficked women, who will be also the first targets. And the examples are many, but what I want to go back to the point in which I started, and which actually Jagmar emphasized about not being, it's not a one issue. Surrogacy does not exist independently as some independent, I see you, Clara, thank you, form of exploitation. Recognition of the links between prostitution and the sexual exploitation, as well as the recognition with the links of forced marriage and surrogacy is very, very important. And I'm going to finish this by just highlighting the recent, well, relatively recent example from Greece, where there was a trafficking ring was busted with a profit at that point of about 500,000, who were recruiting the women from within the European Union. So there were mostly women from Bulgaria, but also women from Russia and from Ukraine, who were then brought to Greece and kept in those fertility clinics, right? And what we have here is a triple exploitation. So some women were brought already as pregnant, and their kids were taken for illegal adoption. Some other women were brought and exploited, impregnated, and they were made to carry a child. And at the same time, the same women were used to extract their eggs for sale. Yeah, we all heard, of course, about the situation in Ukraine. There were recent arrests in Russia, and that's the country where I come from, where surrogacy is legalized. And we are keeping a very close eye on this development because the loopholes in legislations are numerous. And I'm particularly grateful for the recent resolution of the European Parliament that actually recognized that trafficking for surrogacy specifically constitute a specific form of violence against women, and we all have to be alerted and combat this form of violence and exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And now I will try to get back to the speakers with some questions that we've gotten from the audience. One question that we got was if the organization, the Coalition for the Abolition of Surrogate Motherhood, have anything to do with advocacy for or against abortion, or if the focus is on surrogacy. And I think I can answer that just briefly, that the focus is strictly on the abolition of surrogacy motherhood. But of course, what we can see is that in surrogacy contracts, women are forced to give up the right to abortions, even in countries where abortion is legal. So there are, of course, many connections, but it's not possible to uphold the right to abortion if surrogacy motherhood is legalized. I can check in perhaps with Anna Luana. Do you want to add anything else on the topic of abortion?
It is specified in our statutes that we are a feminist coalition for the abolition of surrogacy motherhood, but we do not take a stand on other points. And of course, we are favorable with all which is for the women rights and the right to dispose of her body and reproductive and health rights. And I just put, I hope, the statutes on the conversation.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you about the trends when it comes to legislation on surrogacy internationally. Right now, the Hague Conference on Private and International Law, they have been working for more than 5 years on parentage in the context of surrogacy. Can you tell us something about what's going on there and what you're seeing?
The Hague Conference for International Private Law is working for about 10 years now on an international instrument to regulate surrogacy. This is one of our points, that this international body never took into account the violence against women or the rights of women in their preliminary report for 2012, they precise that exactly what Anna Zobina just said, that surrogacy always existed, and that in the Bible we meet sort of first examples of surrogacy. Several feminist organizations wrote them several times to expose a human rights point of view, and we never had any response. As we saw, there are several persons in the expert group which are in a very clear conflict of interest concerning their work as experts, while in the same time, the same persons are also lawyers who work with families who are who obtain the children through surrogacy. So we took a stand, and we wrote to the Hague conference asking them to take into account also the abolition alternative and not only the regulatory one.
Mm. Thank you for that and for your important work. Also, at the same time, we see that proposed laws in different directions are being put forward in several countries. So we have some countries which are now working to open up surrogacy more widely. For example, the Netherlands, England, Uruguay, and Mexico, and other countries that wants to regulate it. For example, China, Argentina, Ecuador, and Colombia. So what do you think about these different trends, and what can we do to oppose that?
This is obvious, the consequences of the market, because it's huge amounts of money on this practice. This is not only about women who just want to satisfy some persons who suffer because they cannot have children. This is a huge market, and there are several kind of actors, economic actors, legislators, political actors, which are very interested in supporting this this market, and this international transfrontier movement is indeed very present right now. Also because there are other actions by institutions like the International Social Service, who from years made conferences and actions to inform and also to build up an international instrument to regularize the practice. So the countries have all the interest to have a solution, and the first solution they see is the regulation. This is why women human rights are always let apart.
Thank you. Another question that we got in the chat is about what happens to children that are born with disabilities, and what happened to the surrogate mother in those cases. And I know there are several cases where women and children with disability have suffered so much in those situations. Do you have any more information on that, Anna Luana?
Most of the time, children are left alone because the intended parents do not want to take them. Some cases are well known, others are totally ignored because there is no institutional body who monitorize this kind of data. Not in the United States, not in Ukraine, not in Russia, not anywhere, not in Greece, where in any country where the practice is legal, nobody looks what happened to the children, what happened to the mother. There is no data collecting about this kind of situation. So this is just what the media let us to know, and of course the women NGO or child protection NGOs.
Thank you, Anna-Luana. It's just one more example of how intersectional this issue of surrogacy really is. Sexism and women with disabilities and children with disabilities and migration that we've talked about throughout this event. I want to move on to Jagmur and ask you, some advocates of surrogacy point to the issue of consent. What do you think about that? Is it possible to consent to renting out your womb?
The way you framed it, it almost seems like a rhetorical question. So there are, in the feminist criticism of consent, a lot of the time we're picked on the sociological criticism, when I think we're trying to make a political criticism of the notion of consent. So I'm not going to talk about surrogacy specifically, but what I want to say about consent, because I've had it up here of consent, I'm done with it. It will apply to all of those different cases where we bring about women's consent. So when we say, so pregnancy, so because we're talking about pregnancy, it is clear that it is sexually determined, right? So when I hear, for example, in prostitution, oh, but some women choose it or consent to it. Well, they always tell me women, they never tell me men. So even in their answer, it's sexually determined. Here in this case, it's a bit cheating because from the beginning, it's sexually determined. And then when you tell them, well, look, it seems a bit weird that only women are into this. Could there be a psychosocial explanation? Could there be a sort of rearing that explained this? Now, the criticism, so this is the sociological criticism of consent. So you're inquiring into what led you to consent to it. And the reply you get back is, but if we say this, we're socially determined and we have no choice and we can't even decide for ourselves and all of this. So first, those people who say this, they have to explain the empirical reality that is somehow, so the women that are abused in childhood, the poorest women, the most racially discriminated against women that end up in prostitution. So this is an empirical reality that it is not chosen or consented. So even that is easy to demonstrate. But this is not really the key problem with consent. Consent is problematic from the political point of view. Because consent gives, and this is really the criticism of Catherine McKinnon, the way I understand it, and it's saying, look, you have this framework and you can agree or disagree with it. And that is the only option you have. But there is no criticism or no analysis of the framework. There is no inquiry of how the framework came about. And I'm sorry, this is taking a while, but this is, I think, crucial. And this is one thing. And the other thing is that the idea that consent can make the difference between right and wrong is flawed. So for example, if I consent to my torture, it is still torture and it is still harmful. Consent only becomes relevant, as I see it, when you're talking about a practice that is not harmful per se. So if somebody takes a picture of me, it's fine, it's not harmful, they took a photography. But if I did not consent to it, then it's problematic. But the photography per se is not problematic. But either way, the fact that I consented or I did not consent does not change the fact of the nature of the act. It is still taking a photography, it is still torture. And this is why the criticism of rape laws through consent. So consent can never modify the nature of the act. So how can it suddenly turn sex into rape? It's a fallacy, really. It's based on nothing. It's an empty notion. And because we have this whole political culture based on consent, which is about legitimizing a practice, but not inquiring on its nature, we end up with what you were talking about, Anna-Luana, regulation. Because you're trying to change the circumstances and make them better when really it's the heart of the practice. It is inherently wrong. Sorry, it was long and twisted.
No, it's very interesting. I wanted to follow up on that actually, because we had a question that went like this. A friend of mine was a surrogate mother twice in Canada, and she felt so honored to give those women a child? Are you against this also? I can see being against surrogacy as to sell babies, and that would be horrible. I was wondering maybe if you could comment on that question, and perhaps also that your criticism of consent does that hold up also in surrogacy arrangement where there is no money exchange like the altruistic surrogacy situations? What do you think about that?
So again, this money, I'll start with that one because it's easier. Kajsa Ekman has a brilliant answer to that. It's saying, oh, you're exploiting it, but you're doing it for free, so it's less of an exploitation. I mean, what kind of twisted logic is this? And again, the crux of the problem is not really, we're still discussing about circumstances and can we do this and can we do that, but the problem is that you're asking a woman who is penniless to give up her baby. This is what is happening. You know, it's like Rachel Moran when she says, when a woman is hungry, the human decent thing to do is to put bread in her mouth, not your penis. So when you put prostitution like this, it's clear what's going on. And in the individual level, okay, you're happy, but that act has consequences on me. This is why we have law. This is why we have the rule of law, because we're not individual particles and we cannot do as we wish, even if it makes us happy. It has consequences on other women. I hope it answers. It was very
yes, it does. Thank you. And it's also something that we've also said about that in the Swedish women's lobby. It's all part of the same industry, that it's very clear that those countries that have legalized altruistic surrogacy, they can also see that that will increase demand and it will feed into the global commercial surrogacy. So it's not possible really to differentiate between commercial and altruistic surrogacy. We also had a question that I think was directed directly to you. Do you think that the part of the battle in this topic is the fight against the erasure of the word women in legislations?
Could you repeat? Sorry, I didn't.
The question went like this. Do you think that part of the battle in this topic is the fight against the erasure of the word women in legislations?
Absolutely. I'm thinking about the Argentinian case where you have an abortion law that is not exclusively on women. We need to understand who we are as women. We need to affirm we are women. We need to understand what that means in our life, and not just under patriarchy, because we focus a lot on violence, but without the violence, who we are, those things remain. Pregnancy remain, menstruations remain, and they're not necessarily negative, even though painful in all of this. But it really is a fight against women. That is certain.
Also, one last question for you. I was thinking, as a young feminist and working with young women and girls with migrant backgrounds, do you want to say something about like the racist nature that's inherent in the surrogacy industry?
Oh, well, yeah, I think I should open up to to other speakers as well. Well, it is pretty clear, even outsourcing pregnancy, to me, it's clear. It's taken from the industrial idea of you take it to the East. And then you have specific requests based on the skin color. So this is obviously a racist industry. But perhaps others want to add something more, because that's too much.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. Anna, Sabina, do you want to add something about that as well, like just the racism within surrogacy?
Well, every industry that exploits women is also racist. I do not know anyone that is not racist. You know, I always go back to the most obvious example is, of course, pornography and prostitution, where you have within the industry of exploitation. So you already have all this scale of exploitation, and then there are different women positioned, right? So depending on your preferences, whether you want a submissive Asian woman who, not being submissive now, just got murdered, 6 of them in Atlanta, whether you want to have the Russian super hot wives who will do everything for you, whether you want to have a hot Latina. So the categorization, the racist and racialized categorizations and kind of stereotypization and fetishization is absolutely at the core of this specific exploitation of women, which is pornography. And as I said, this is sexual exploitation. It is never disconnected from the reproductive exploitation. So what Jagmur just mentioned, the choosing of babies, this is the most obvious example, the skin color, the eye color, the background. I mean, this is like a catalog. You open and you choose. And, you know, the couples, interestingly, there are all of this, it's not just white people from America who would choose, for example, Nepalese women as surrogates because they have a lighter skin color. The Nepalese women who are trafficked from Nepal into India, right? But there is also, you know, the Arab customers who would choose women from Ukraine because it's fashionable to have a little bit lighter skin babies. So it's all very, on a global scale of this racist dynamics, surrogacy fits so perfectly to satisfy the racist demands, which are the, you know, the patriarchal demands, of course.
Thank you, Anna. Also, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit what you think would be the long-term implications for migrant women if surrogacy was to be legalized.
Oh, well, it will be a disaster. It will be a disaster, just the same disaster as you have in Germany legalizing prostitution. Any industry of exploitation that exploits women, that becomes legalized and normalized, and then institutionalized. This is the next step, because, you know, industry always seeks for profit. So you might start with one little clinic here and there, and then you realize, oh, there is more demand. We can serve customers arriving from other countries here. So the demand keeps growing. And even if it's not, it will be artificially generated because the industry needs income. And then they will need a supply. And supply will come from the poorest countries, from the poorest women, and the migrant women will be first who will be, I mean, they will either be trafficked for purpose of exploitation and surrogacy, or they will migrate for some other reasons, and then they will be exploited in surrogacy. But I really do think that surrogacy is the next frontier for feminists. Maybe not the next, but the urgent one. We know enough about prostitution. We can put numbers and figures and arguments on the table. You know, nobody is going to say, oh no, it's so wonderful because in Germany they legalized it and it just eliminated all violence against women and brought trafficking down. We know this is not the case. We have 10 years or more to prove the case. And the same with Netherlands. And that's why we see this slowly the turn towards the Nordic model, because more countries starting to realize that it's intrinsically harmful. There is nothing that is going to make this industry not harmful if we legalize it. We don't have such arguments and such kind of experience with the industry of surrogacy yet, and it's coming. And that's why, you know, what I was speaking, that we're trying to be a proactive organization. We don't want to wait until we have so many babies abandoned because they have disabilities, so many mothers with dissociative disorders, and so many court cases. We want to prevent it. And going in the path of legalization, the commercial legalization will be an absolute disaster in terms of considering the current global context of wars, displacement, the natural disasters, the climate disasters, and all the women who are being stranded in different parts, you know, looking for better life, looking for income. This will be an invitation for exploitation for this industry to groom them, to target them, to traffic them, and to exploit them. That's it.
Thank you, Anna. I was thinking, since you mentioned prostitution several times, and also talked about the importance of recognizing the supply and demand that's feeding into the surrogacy industry. Do you think that we could have the same approach as we've had when it comes to prostitution to surrogacy, as in prohibiting surrogacy clinics and bureaus, and also surrogacy purchase? Or do you have any other ideas about how to legally come about attacking this industry?
Is it a question to me?
Yes.
Well, yes, absolutely. We have to take a very clear stance, a human rights-based stance, based on the universal human rights and women's rights in particular, that human beings are not for sale, and women are included, as long as we think that women are human beings, that they should not be exploited in this industry. And the only way to enforce it legally is to legally punish those people who are promoting this practice or actually practicing this, as well as those who are seeking to purchase babies. It must be made crystal clear through the legislation that there is no such thing as a positive right to have a baby. No one, not one single person is entitled to have a baby. We may all sympathize and empathize with somebody who, for various reasons, might not be able to carry a child, or it's a gay couple, or it's a woman who cannot get pregnant. This does not give anyone a right, a positive right to acquire a child. And the similar way as, you know, if you actually ban surrogacy in one country, the persons, whether a couples, man or woman, who try to pursue this internationally, go into another jurisdiction, which is what's happening right now in Ukraine and Russia and Latin America and Canada, they should be made legally punishable by the law of the country to which they belong, where they have citizenship. This is what I think. It will be a very strong and clear message. Yes.
Yes, that's very clear. Thank you, Anna. We had some questions also about the consequences for children that was born through surrogacy. And one question in particular was if there are organizations for children that are born for surrogacy. And I know that at least in the US, there is at least one association of children that has been born through surrogacy that are now grown up, that are actually fighting against opposing surrogacy. I was wondering, Anna Luana, perhaps, do you have any more information about the children in surrogacy and the possible harms that they face? And we're all women's rights experts in this panel, but do you have any information that you would like to share?
As far as I know, there is a donor-conceived children association in Europe. Some of them are surrogacy-born persons, and they do not agree with surrogacy and fight against them. Even then, they say that they were raised by the parents who love them, and so on and so forth. I think that a big problem is the fact that, generally speaking, it's a very, how to say, a very kind image to see children who bring happiness to persons who are in suffering for not having children. So all these story, all these narrative, all these images are very hard to fight. It's not fighting against people who want children. It's not fighting against the children. Of course, it's fighting against a practice who exploits women and children. And I personally know about situations in France, for instance, where children born through surrogacy were abandoned by their parents because they were not conformed to what they were expecting of. And these children was in social care, and the parents go abroad, making another child who was conformed. And the one who was the elder was seen always in the social care system, and from time to time he was going to his parents, meeting his friend, his brother, and knowing that he was not conforming to the contract. But these situations are not known, they are not studied, they are not taken into account by nobody. The only situations that we know, the media is interested in, the researchers are interested in, are the situation that the militant NGOs want them to get known. But now the one which are problematic. And of course, this is very difficult to say, yes, there are kids who are very happy with their families, and this is absolutely okay and very good. But there are also children who are in very big risk. We don't know nothing about it. And the problem is that adults who do not respect a limit, who do not respect something which is forbidden, do whatever they want to do, even to their kids. And for the moment, we don't know how to study and how to look at those situations. And I know other cases, but there are individual cases, and I don't like to discuss individual cases. I would like to discuss about principles based in human rights.
Thank you, Anna-Luana. We really need some children's rights organizations to come on board and start fighting against surrogacy, and to do an analysis of all the ways in which surrogacy motherhood is incompatible with the Convention of the Rights of Children. I was before we wrap up, I was wondering also, Anna-Luana, if you can give some tips on where to find more information about the coalition, because we've had several questions also about how to know more about the organizations and the presentations that has been shown here today, and different materials that has been talked about.
About the coalition, I just want to put the link here in the conversation so that you can see what we are doing. And the actions concerning the Hague conference. And also the text of the International Convention. There is also a newsletter, monthly newsletter or 2 monthly newsletter. The point is that our international actions right now are oriented through the Hague conference, and also at a European level. We think it is very important to raise awareness to the European parliamentarians concerning the surrogacy and the respect of the women's rights and the children's rights, and to avoid them to take measures to regulate surrogacy in Europe. Because the tendency right now is to say that, well, let's look what the Hague Conference is doing, and to do the same. And this is really a big risk.
Thank you, Anna-Luana, and thank you to all of our speakers, and to all of you that have been listening for this event. And I hope that you will join our common struggle to fight surrogacy industry, as it is one of the most urgent threats to women's human rights and also a form of violence against women, as has been described so many times tonight. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.